wanted to know how to read through the Bible, if you've wanted to have some sort of system to work through Scripture, they're up here. They're free. There's lots of them. There's also cake. So come grab some cake. And then, well, everybody left. Oh wait, I was going to Lemuel. I hope everybody's enjoyed the testimonies that we've had on and off this last term. Testimonies are encouraging because we hear how God has worked in each other's lives. We hear how God has worked in lives of those who are a few years beyond us, and that's always encouraging. So tonight we have Glenn Darrow, who's a good friend from our church up in Felton. He's been made his career in the Army and is here to share with us. A couple more will be coming back in, but I'll give you the floor.
I appreciate you letting me come and worship with you because it's always refreshing. I love that song, that Jesus' name is like honey to our lips, His Spirit's like water to our souls. And that is definitely true. And when you're hungry and thirsty spiritually, there's nothing like getting to come and worship with other believers. It's indeed a blessing. So my name is Glenn Darrow. I am a major in the United States Army. I am now at the Naval Postgraduate School just down the road in Monterey, working on a master's in operations research, which people always ask, what is that? And the buzzword we like to say is it's the science of better. So how to improve things. Data analytics is another thing. So that's what I'm doing now. I have a nice cushy desk job and enjoying being a student again, because it's been a long time since I've been in your seats, and now going back to writing papers, and it's been rough. But, so I'm the youngest of 4 or 5 kids. My parents lost 2 in between my 2 oldest sisters. So I'm the only boy and the youngest, which means I got beat unmercifully by my sisters. They are 8, 5, and 3 years older than me. And my background, I grew up in a Christian home. My parents were actually missionaries to Haiti before I was born, and had planned on, when they went to the field, they were thinking they would be career missionaries, live there the rest of their lives. And my youngest older sister was born there, and she got really sick, as did my mom. And due to their health, God brought them back to the States. And they'd always planned on going back, but God had other plans and left them in the States. And so I grew up in the church, and I don't remember a time not going to church. And when I was 6 years old, I remember something unique happened in service, because normally the pastor was up on the pulpit and preaching, and then he would finish, and then he would walk down the steps, and the choir would sing, and he would stand there. And then this Sunday, some guy came forward and was talking to him. That's odd, because it didn't happen in the church that I grew up in. And so I asked my mom, I was like, on the way home, I said, Mom, what was that guy doing? I said, well, he was going to talk to the pastor because he was going to become a Christian believer. I said, oh, okay. Have you done that? And she said yes. She did it when she was 6. And I can remember in retrospect looking back in like my 6-year-old mind, thinking like, oh, well, this guy went and talked to the pastor. My mom did it when she was 6. I should get to talk to the pastor. And so the following Sunday, my mom was back with the kids in the nursery. My dad was, I think, up in the choir. And my sisters were not anticipating anything, otherwise they would have grabbed my hands. And during the invitation time, I just walked out and went and shook the pastor's hand. And he, asked silly questions like, do you believe in Jesus? And I grew up in a Christian home, so it's like, yes. Do you want to go to heaven? Yes. And so pray this little prayer with me. And he pronounced me a Christian, and a couple weeks later I got dunked in a tank of water. And so what was significant about that is that I grew up in a church where, they preached salvation by faith alone, in Christ alone, but it was a whole lot of, morality and teaching. And I remember at one point, it was very focused upon your decision that your salvation was hinged upon. And in the church that we went to later, evangelists came and even, led people in prayer and said, now write this date in the back of your Bible or in the front of your Bible, so when Satan comes and, makes you doubt your salvation, you can point to this date. And so when I was in middle school and 8th grade, I even led a Bible study because they had encouraged us at church campus to go lead Bible studies in our school. And that summer, or that year, I made a friend, Josh, who hadn't gone to church, and invited him. I was so excited he was coming. And I was like, yeah, Josh he's going to church camp with us, he's going to get saved. And the pastor was preaching about having assurance of your salvation, and what does it mean to know Christ. And I can't remember everything he was saying, but throughout the week, the last night, I was like, oh my goodness, I don't think I'm a Christian. And so I grabbed one of the senior high guys that I trusted and respected, and was like, hey, Scott, will you pray with me? Because I don't think I'm a Christian. And he led me through the little cross track. I don't know if you've seen those that unfold into a cross, that I had led other people through. And I just remember weeping and he was like, okay, pray this little prayer with me. Pray this prayer with me. I just remember thinking I believe. And unfortunately, when we got back to the rest of the group, the youth pastor, one of the guys was real excited. He's like, hey, John, Glenn just got saved. And the pastor said, Glenn, are you sure? Because, you've led this Bible study and you've been a leader in the youth. And I'm like, I think so. I don't know. And what happened in the span of the next day or so before we went back home, he said, well, are you sure you didn't mean that you just rededicated your life? And I was like, well, okay, I guess so. And so, Sunday they made this big announcement. These number of people made decisions, and Glendale rededicated his life. And why I share that is because, remember, the focus on the date, right? Right, this date. And Satan used that in my life for many years after that. And, because that question was like, well, was it when I was 6? Or was it now? Or ever? And because my assurance of my salvation was based upon my own personal decision to follow Christ. And we'll come back to that. But going forward, life at home was good generally, but my oldest sister, when I was in middle school, she attempted suicide. And my dad was working overseas in Korea at the time, and came home every 6 months. And she spent time in a couple different mental hospitals. And there's an incredible testimony. If you were to meet her now, you would never have guessed that. And if you ask Jenny, what changed, because we did group therapy and she was on different medications and all that. And what really changed in her life and what healed her mind was the Lord and being in His Word. And, if you'd ask her that, she'd say that. But that was kind of the turmoil. Dad was an aerospace engineer after he came back from Korea, or Haiti, which is interesting work for him, but not terribly stable. And so he worked out of state a lot. And my whole 4 years of high school, he worked in Wichita, Kansas, and we lived in a suburb of Dallas, Texas. So he was the guy who, came home every other weekend and told me to mow the lawn. And when I got looking toward college, I thought I wanted to be a doctor and was looking at, these top name schools like Johns Hopkins and, MIT or Harvard or something. And then I started, as a senior, filling out applications and then looking at the cost, which are even higher now, but they were exorbitant then. And I was like, how on earth am I going to pay for this? And an Army recruiter was walking around the high school and talking and handing out business cards, and I just took his card just to get him to go away. And honestly, and emptied out my stuff on my dresser when I got home. I'm filling out this scholarship application or college application, and I was like, Army will pay for school. And so I was talking to a recruiter, and then I found out about this ROTC gig where you can, get them to pay for college and come in as an officer, and I thought that was a pretty good deal, and got the scholarship, and went to the University of Texas at Arlington, or as we like to call it, UT almost. It's not UT Austin. I'll spare you the details on how I got there, but during that time, so I was a believer, but was really an infant believer, and not spending time really reading my Bible and in the Word, wasn't really plugged into a church and growing, and now was in the midst of a very godless culture. And the ROTC guys, like Army guys, generally speaking, there's a lot of, especially kind of like, post 9/11, a lot of people think very highly of the military, but they're just a bunch of godless people in a lot of regards, immoral. And so now I was living in the midst of that, and the age-old saying that bad company corrupts good character, that definitely proved the case in my life, and fell into sin and immorality, and God, David in the Psalms, he writes that when I went astray, I was afflicted, and your hand was heavy upon me. And God was gracious that I didn't experience any physical consequences of my sin, but his Spirit certainly was chastising me and disciplining me, and was just despairing, even thinking like, man, maybe I should kill myself. Again, he was gracious to me, as he says, that he raised him up out of the miry clay in the pit. And so God, after disciplining me, did that. And I graduated college and commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army, and was made an engineer officer. Ended up finishing in history in the Army, just as you are an engineer, and which corresponds to, basically, it's like, think infantry, but with some C4, and like, we're going to teach you how to blow things up. Which I was pretty excited about, because at that point I had decided I didn't want to be a doctor. I'd worked in a couple positions in a hospital. Was really enjoying running around the woods and playing soldier. I mean, we had guns and blanks, and it's like great fun, what boys do as kids, but now it's, cooler and high tech. And so I wanted combat arms, and I got combat engineers, and went to Germany for my first assignment to the 1st Infantry Division that was stationed in Germany at the time. And while I was finishing up my initial Army training as a lieutenant, I found out that we would be going to Iraq. And so I said goodbye to my family in December, went to Germany, and about 2 months later, we left Germany to Kuwait. Were in Kuwait for a couple weeks before we flew north into Iraq. And I had been in the Army as far as active duty as an officer for about 8 months, and was a completely unexperienced green lieutenant, 23 years old, now put in charge of 25 plus or minus guys in a lot of combat equipment. And our unit was reorganized to fight as infantry. So that means, patrols, raids, ambushes, but then we did some combat engineer roles, which were route clearances, looking for these roadside bombs. And my first mission leading my platoon was my first actual mission in Iraq. And thankfully it was, had some adult supervision with some senior sergeants. And it was a simple mission, but during that time there, again, the Christian fellowship was sorely lacking. In my battalion of about 500 guys, there were only a handful of actual believers. Our chaplain, sadly, was not a good officer or soldier. He was not a good chaplain, and he was not a good minister. And as things became more stressful, instead of spending more time running to God's word, I neglected it. And that weighed very heavily on me as the year progressed. And I'll share just a couple stories of specific incidences that happened there, just as far as God's hand in retrospect, looking back on. When I was there, we didn't have all the fancy equipment that, like ground penetrating radar and things like that could find these bombs. And so how you would look for a roadside bomb was drive slow enough that you saw something on the side of the road that looked odd. Or if you were walking, find something, which is probably not the ideal technique. In one particular mission, we're supposed to clear this route, main supply route, and one of my sergeants was out and actually dismounted walking, and he said, "Hey sir, I think I see something." And at the time, we were dealing essentially with the JV squad of insurgents, and we backed up, found what we thought was the firing point, because it was all, you'd have a 155 millimeter as far as the base field artillery round filled with high explosives, and an electrical blasting cap in the top. And so there was some guy hiding in the wood line that would touch that to a battery and cause it to explode. So the theory is if you can find that point, then you can safely neutralize the device. And we kicked out, did that. And so I was taking pictures of this device for the intel guys, and two sergeants came up on either side of me and like, "Oh, that looks odd, sir." Brushing stuff off, and this little like red piece was exposed, and it didn't click immediately what that was. So I kept brushing, and then this little copper wire popped out. And I stood up and looked at them and thought, let's back away. And so what that was a remotely detonated device, a remotely detonated bomb, and I had my hand on it. My soldiers were at the time prepping the explosive to destroy the other device, and we backed up and called the EOD techs, and they came out and sent their little robot down, and little Air Force tech sergeant was, "Sir, that is most definitely a remote detonated device. You guys are lucky." And to this day, this side of heaven, whether it was the battery didn't work, or the guy fell asleep, or we scared him off, or whatever, I don't know. But they tried to destroy the device or break it open to kind of get some more intel on it. And long story short, they ended up blowing it up or causing it to explode. And it kicked a plume of dust or debris up in the air about 100 feet and left a nice crater right where I was standing. And it was, in retrospect, a pretty dumb thing for us to have done, but just God's graciousness in that. And at the time, I didn't think much of it. It's just like after the fact, then you're like, whoa, what just happened? And so that was one instance that was pretty impactful, and seeing in retrospect God's hand of protection. And another time, we were in the process of, again, doing another route clearance, and two helicopters were flying, scout helicopters were flying in front of us just to clear the route. And my gunner popped down from the hatch of the Humvee and said, "Hey sir, I heard an explosion." And I was like, "Okay, what was that?" And we went forward, and the Kiowa pilots, the helicopter pilots said, "Hey, we saw an explosion." And we pulled up, and there was a car with a flashers on, and shattered windshield and dirt everywhere. And what had happened, long story short, there was a guy who was trying to put in a roadside bomb. And when he heard the helicopter, that spooked him. And he got in a hurry, something you never want to do with explosives, and he blew himself up. And we got to pick up what was left of him. And I remember we stuck the guy in his trunk, and one of my soldiers drove him to the next Iraqi Army checkpoint. And then we had to keep finishing our mission, clearing the rest of the route for this big convoy that was coming north and providing security for them. And I remember as we were driving away, just thinking, I was like, what we know about explosives, that guy's mind didn't even have time to realize he had made a mistake. And I seriously doubt he woke up that morning thinking, I'm going to blow myself up. It's just like that. And now he was he stepped into eternity. It's really made me think about our mortality. And there are other instances where, we faced some kind of mild enemy opposition and bombs and things like that. And I was surprised that how many of my soldiers hardened themselves to that reality, to having your mortality kind of much more present. And my platoon sergeant, my right-hand guy, he was like, "Oh, I'll go to chapel after the first close call." And the first mission that I didn't go out with him on because I had gotten really sick and I couldn't go. Those 155 rounds, there was a series of these, 15 of them, what's called daisy chained together, like in a line, and they went off right on his vehicle. And God was very gracious. Again, they said JV squad, most of the blasts went up and not toward him. And so his gunner got a little bit of a concussion, but other than that, they just drove through a wall of dirt and a good concussion. And but yet, he, was still not interested in things of the Lord. And when we'd been there for a while, one of my soldiers, we were on a slow mission, and he said, "Sir, do you ever get scared?" And I was like, "Yeah, sure. I mean, of course. Like, when the explosion goes off or you see tracer rounds coming toward us. But as far as living in day-to-day fear, no, because I know for certain that when I die, I will go to heaven, and that's better by far." And so God was gracious in that. But it was a difficult time. I got R&R about 9 months in and went home and was again involved in some immorality and came back. And after we went back to Germany, after we left Iraq, the first night I was there, I was introduced to a guy who's now my best friend. He was actually in Iraq on the other side of the camp. Never met him. Small little camp. Strong Christian guy. And Pete Whitney discipled me, though he didn't actually call it discipling. And after a few months, I moved to a staff position, and so now I'm sitting behind a desk instead of kicking in doors and blowing things up. And so I had a sport bike motorcycle, and I would drive that fast to kind of get that adrenaline rush. And one Sunday after eating lunch with Pete, I was taking a back road home, and at the time, God was gracious. Again, I wasn't hot rodding the bike, but I misjudged a curve, and I just remember thinking, I'm not going to stick this curve. And the last thing I remember was the bike falling out from underneath me as it went down into a ditch, and I went over the handlebars into a farmer's field. And then I came to when the paramedics were cutting my jacket off. And I did that self-assessment, and it's like, I'm pretty sure I broke my wrist. And so I got a nice, the ulna and the radius were both broken. The radius was a compound fracture. Had to have a titanium plate and 6 screws in. And I was 24, and I thought, this is very painful, bones heal. And one of the officers in our brigade had been picked to go lead these special transition teams, military transition teams to Iraq, sort of like special forces, but not. And he asked if I wanted to go. I was like, yes. You know, if it'll get me out of making PowerPoint slides. I don't know if you've ever had to make PowerPoint slides. Yeah. And my boss, the major I work for, said, hey, you know, you got to get the docs to clear you. And so I went to the clinic, and the doctor looked at me like I was crazy. I hadn't done any post-op. I had just gotten the cast off, and so I thought I was fine. And he said, you're going to have months of occupational therapy you got to do. And he said, not this time. And so God graciously delivered me from a second deployment to Iraq with a motorcycle accident. And then the other thing that he did with that is I had a manual transmission car, which was exceedingly hard to drive with a really messed up right wrist. And my buddy Pete, like, I drove it one time after they released me from the hospital. I was driving it to chapel and trying to shift. And I got to chapel, I was like, this is not safe. I'm going to get in a wreck. And I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I guess I'm going to have to rent an automatic or something like that. And Pete was getting married in a few months. He was like, well, Hannah and I don't get married until September. Why don't you come and live with me? And I'm like, really? He said, yeah. And so then began like this month and a half of intensive discipleship. And Pete and I would pray together, and he taught me how to pray and I learned how to pray by praying with him. And, you know, really encouraged me to get into the Word and start reading the Bible. And specifically confronted me on sin in my life. And not as in like pointing the finger, but as in like genuinely sorrowful to hear about the sin in my life and say, Glenn, you know, we gotta do something, man. And so I first started reading the Bible for the first time because Pete and I had this argument about God's sovereignty and salvation, and I was gonna prove him wrong because he was quoting all these verses and I didn't have any to fire back at him. And as I was reading the Bible, I just remember thinking like, well, I'm not finding anything that supports my position, and I'm kind of seeing what he's saying here. And God is so gracious with us that even irreverent prayers, you know, he doesn't just strike us dead. I remember praying and just saying, God, I think this is what your words say. And I don't really like it. But you're God, and I'm not. And so if that's, you know, if that's what your word says, then, and God took that and then began to transform my heart. And now passages of the Bible that just like never made sense to me, like the whole book of John. Or not the whole book, but significant portions of John just started to come alive, and the Spirit was giving understanding, and God was changing my heart about sin. And I love the artist Rich Mullins. I don't know if any of you guys have heard of Rich Mullins, but one of the lines in one of his songs, he says, you stripped away the mask of life they had placed upon the face of death. And the Bible talks about that we should keep ourselves from, you know, the deceitfulness of sin. And that's what it is. It's you know, God has created good things, and Satan twists those and perverses, and it's deceitful. You know, sin never satisfies, it only destroys. You know, God's true and Satan's still a liar. And so he was, I think, for the first time, I really felt like I was understanding God's word and in his word and reading it. And I got moved to another part of Germany, and my buddy Pete moved back to the States and got out of the Army. And I guess not quite a year later, a friend said, hey, why don't you come on this backpacking trip with us? We're going this Bible study that I was a part of. They're going to the German and Austrian Alps over the 4th of July weekend. And I went and met this cute girl named Valerie there. And I thought, of course, you know, I leave, I go to another part of Germany, and moves here. And found out she didn't actually move there. She was just there visiting the friends who were running that ministry from Colorado. And she actually gave me the cold shoulder pretty much the whole backpacking trip. Like I was trying to get to know her, and my buddy John was like, "Man, you should get her number." Hey, I'm working on it. And it was Germany was in the World Cup, and they said, "Hey, come back, watch the game at the little sports thing with us." And instead of just going straight back to where I lived, and that last night, she was just a little bit more friendly. And I left a book there, and my buddy called me back, and I was like, "Hey, I was thinking about asking Val if she'd be interested in writing." He's like, "I don't know. Sounds like a good idea. Why don't you ask her?" Like, you know, not mentally prepared for that. And so it's very formal. And I said, "Oh yeah, you know, I was wondering if you'd be interested in corresponding." So guys, you know, it worked. You know, she gave me her email address, and so I emailed her back, or emailed her when she got home, and that proceeded, you know, lots of emails back and forth. And our first month of conversation was like all theological in nature, and you know, what do you believe about this, and what do you believe about this? Because we were slightly different camps that God has unified us now. And then I was like, you know, I want to marry this girl, and began studying 1 Corinthians 13, Ephesians 5, and other passages that talk about husbands and love and marriage, and realizing like, wow. I called my dad. "Dad, I think I love this girl." And we were, she felt the same way, and we were wanting to honor her parents, and so I went and talked to her dad. And Frank is a meat cutter by trade. He owns his own private little meat cutting shop in a rural town in Colorado, like whole quarters of beef hanging in the freezer, and this giant grinder and knives all along the wall. And he's former Special Forces, Army Special Forces, was a Vietnam vet, and jumped into Iran later. And honestly, at the time, I like to tell the story now, like, you know, please don't kill me. But I was just so worried that he would say no, you know, because we decided that if her dad said no, we were going to honor that and trust that God, because Frank is a godly man and that he has more wisdom than I do. And I was just so afraid, you know, and he was like, "Well, Glenn, I'm a simple guy. What exactly are you asking?" I was like, "Sir, I love your daughter, and I want to marry her, and I'd like your permission to propose." And then he said, "Well, you can tell her." I said, "Not right now." I'm like, "Okay, we're prepared for that. I can wait." He said, "Or because I'm ornery, you can tell her no." I said, "No." I'm like, now like the world is spinning. And then he said, "Or you can tell her." I said, "Yes." You know, pending her response, welcome to the family. What just happened? So he was obviously playing with me a little bit. So I asked her to marry me. I did not give her the other two options. I didn't say, "Your dad also said these two things." I said, "Your dad said yes. You know, we're married." And so from the time we met to the time we got married was 6.5 months, and it was all via long distance. I was still in Germany, she was in Colorado, and we counted it up like right before we got married, that including the 4-day trip that we met on that she gave me the cold shoulder. And the side note to that was that our friends had tried to set her up with my buddy John, and so they had emailed back and forth a little bit. And John had a thing for this other girl who was on the backpacking trip. And so Valerie felt like John was trying to pawn her off onto me. And I was completely unaware of any of it. Until like right before, you know, after I was like, "Oh yeah, I gotta tell John, you know, like, you know, that we're getting married." She was like, "Oh yeah, about that." And then she gave me the backstory. But God is gracious. He knew what he was doing. John and Carolyn are now happily married, and Valerie and I are happily married. And so I left active duty, and we thought God was leading us to the mission field. And we got out, went to the University of North Texas. It's like, I'm going to get a degree in engineering, because that's what they do in engineering with the Army, and go to Africa or something. And I lost my civilian job. I was a hall director in the dorm there. I was an RA in college, loved that job. Hall director, not so much. It was more the bosses I had, and it was a very different experience. And so instead of decorating for Christmas, we got to box up our stuff and move out of the apartment. And we were expecting our first child, and she was 8 months pregnant. And as we were packing things up, she went into labor early, and Sophia came a little early. She was her Christmas baby, December 22nd. And so I had now no job, health insurance that was going to run out in a few weeks when they said, okay, you're terminated as of this date. And my sister-in-law, who lived in Texas, she said, well, you can come stay with us. She was a single lady who was a nurse. And so I had to move all of my stuff into my sister-in-law's garage, which is very humbling, and having a newborn and who had some medical issues. But God was incredibly gracious, because the day after I got asked for my resignation, I got a call an email from this lieutenant colonel at Army Human Resource Command saying, hey, we have this special project, we're looking for volunteers. And I was in the reserve at the time. And so God opened the door to work. And I said, well, hey, 2 weeks of pay is better than no pay. And 2 weeks turned into a couple months, turned into another year. And while we were there, I just remember we were in St. Louis. We have our now like 5-month-old. And I'm going, this was nowhere in the 5-year plan. Like St. Louis was not in the 5-year plan. And God directs our steps. And what's amazing about that is, you have this vision, or you might think, I'm going to do this or that. But what I've learned is I generally speaking have no idea what I need or really what's going to make you happy. You think, oh, if I could only have that, if I can get there to that state in life, then I will be happy. But you have no idea what it will be like there. And so, but God knows better than us, and he directs our steps. And he led me there. And we thought we were interested in pursuing the chaplaincy, so I did a semester of seminary, and God kind of closed the door to that and changed our hearts in that. And lo and behold, he opened the door to become an analyst, which in some regards is not quite as exciting as being a combat engineer, but a little safer, and he's given ability with that. And in that interim times, from when we thought we were going to pursue missions to we thought we were going to pursue the chaplaincy, I kind of had this mindset, which maybe some of you could relate to growing up in the church, that there's this hierarchy, right? So there's like Christians and just everybody, church members, and then there's, people who lead Bible studies, and then there's, professional or full-time ministry, and then like at the pinnacle is like your missionaries, right? And what I've seen is that that's not really how it works in God's economy. It's interesting, Paul, in writing, he advises that, that people should stay in the position that they're in, that, and with the exception, he says, if you were a slave, by all means, if you can gain your freedom. But that God has put us in positions to bear witness there. And I thought, I got to go back to Africa. I'd spent a month in Africa. And if I really want to serve God, if I want to love God, if I want to grow, and I want to be walking with the Lord, then I need to be on the mission field. And what I saw was that's not the case at all. God has placed you where you're at with a specific purpose in mind. And you interact with people in the dorm or in your apartment or at your job or in class that if you were somewhere else, you wouldn't. And as an analyst and as a student at MPS, I've gotten the opportunity to share the gospel with a number of other officers. I haven't seen any come to faith, but I wouldn't have had those opportunities had I been somewhere else. And so God was teaching me that lesson. And then the other lesson that he was teaching me is, you know, God says a lot about, in the Bible, a lot about marriage and a lot about fathers and children. And I realized I had a lot of learning to do on that. And not saying that people who don't have children or who aren't married can't serve as ministers. Obviously, Timothy is a prime example of that, right, in the Bible. But for me personally, I needed to learn about being a husband and being a father. And I told my single buddies that hung out with in Germany before I got married. After Dawn, I got married, a few months ago. I'd gone out to dinner. She's like, oh, why don't you can go out with the guys. I was like, guys, I tell you what, before I got married, I was not selfish. I was not very selfish. But, I was a single captain. I had a huge apartment to myself, and I had this nice sports sedan that I bought, and did whatever I wanted, whenever I wanted. There wasn't anyone else to consider. And then all of a sudden, you interject a new person in there, and this amazing thing. So you have this mindset going in that I'll get married and I will just be happy. And that's the fairy tales, and they lived happily ever after. Right? But the reality is, you have put two sinful people in very close proximity that, interestingly enough, do not have the exact same views on things, like what pattern Polish pottery you should buy. Actual story. Or, what you should do or how you want to do things. And I remember a conversation when we were biking together. We bought bicycles and we were riding in Germany, and I was just like, oh man, this feels good, like pedaling. And I looked back and she was laying back there, pulled over, and she was a little hot. And she's like, I am not one of your army buddies. I was right. You're not one of my army buddies. I didn't want to marry one of my army buddies. Much prettier. So what I saw in my buddy Pete when he was getting married, I saw this thing, and this book was, I forget the book, but one of the main questions, one of the main things, it was, what if God's purpose in marriage was not so much to make you happy, but to make you holy? And that this was now an environment where these sins were being exposed, like iron sharpening iron, right? So I wasn't selfish until I got married, and then my wife exposed my selfishness. And then I like to say that I was an incredibly patient person until we had children. And then our first, who is a sweet, precious girl, she's 8 now, she had reflux and colic, and when she was a baby, she would just scream, almost unconsolably. I had to bounce her all the time. She's very hyper now. And so God gave me this beautiful little girl that was grating at that and going like, you're not patient. That's a fruit of the Spirit, right? And you don't have it. And so God has blessed us now with 5 children. We lost 2 in between our 2 oldest boys, had 2 miscarriages, but Sophia, Emma, Aiden, Peter, and Tobias. 8, 6, 5, 2, almost 3, and 10 months. And they are the joy of my life. And what I've come to understand is that they're my flock, or my mission field right now. And that God is incredibly gracious. I had the opportunity, as part of our family devotions that Val and I were felt very strongly that as believers, we need to be preaching the gospel to our children. We need to be studying God's word together in the home, praying together. And so we have family devotions, and it's, like not real deep theologically often, just, reading a short story from the Bible and talking about it and singing some songs. And Val got to see in Sophia's heart, because she was, obviously home with her during the day, what was going on. And before we moved out here, we were having time, and Val said, "Well, Daddy, how does a 6-year-old believe, or how can a 6-year-old believe?" And it was such an incredible opportunity. So I got to sit down with my 6-year-old at the time and go through Bible verses. I took her to Romans, going to Romans 3:23, Romans 6:23, and Romans 10, and having her, she was starting to, learn to read, and having her read them, and talking to her about what it means to know the Lord. And partway through, she just looked up at me and she said, "Daddy, will you pray with me?" And I'm not gonna cry. Yeah. And so I said, "I tell you what, why don't I pray for you, and then you pray and talk to God." And what she poured back out was just the scripture that we had been discussing, and that God used that in her heart at 6 years old to show her sinfulness and her deserving of hell and need for Christ. And so I was able to pray with my daughter and see her come to know the Lord. I've not yet with the other 4. We're still praying with them and for them and teaching them. But I guess one of the things I just encourage you with is that don't think that life is up ahead. Life is here and now. And I'm, apart from a couple of crazy incidences in Iraq, vast majority of the time was actually very mundane and boring. I was not an incredibly stellar leader. I was average, and I'm not a guy that they're going to write a book about, trust me. Or if they did, no one would buy it. But say an example of that, God is faithful where we're at and meets us where we're at and is gracious to us and directs our ways, and his ways are not our ways. And he uses, for those of you guys who've been coming to Trinity, Pastor's been preaching through Ecclesiastes, which has been amazing. And one of the things is, a few Sundays back, he talked about the crooked things, the hard things in life that God has made crooked, no one can straighten. And that God uses those hard times to grow us. And the times in Iraq, in retrospect, looking back, losing my job and going, how am I going to provide for my family? And then watching God open the door and provide. And then watching God work in our home and our family. And in our first 5 years of marriage, we've been married for going almost 10 years now, 9.5 years. The first 5 years were really, really rough. And we're both Christians who grew up in Christian homes. And we didn't, God was gracious, so we both had the mindset like divorce isn't an option. So we're either going to be happily married or unhappily married. And we wrestled with that. And it wasn't like every day was bad. It's just like I said, you put 2 sinners together and you don't know how to deal with sin or past the sin that I confessed and God granted repentance of. It's going to be hard. But God is incredibly gracious, and as much as I would not choose to relive that, when we lost these 2 babies, one, she was 11 weeks, and the other one, she was, I think, 8 weeks. And I knew they would be hard on Val, because she's the mom. I had no idea how hard it would be on me. As a big, tough Army guy, I spent a lot of time crying and weeping. And God use that really hard time and circumstance to, instead of push us apart, graciously to pull us together. And for me to just hold her and love her. And God has used that and really done a work in our marriage. And though our marriage is not perfect by any means, I think it's good. And there's a lot of love between us now. And He's blessed us with these kids. And kids are definitely, this is the fruit of the womb, is a reward, is a blessing. And that is so much the case. Don't believe the lie that the world wants to tell you that children, marriage is like, that old ball and chain, or that it's, kids, like you don't want kids, you gotta wait till you're done with whatever, or Satan is still a liar, and God's word is still true. God said it's not good for man to be alone, and He created woman, and He made us male and female, and He created the first marriage. And because of that, Satan absolutely hates it. And he does everything he can to attack it, especially Christian marriage, And it's only God's grace that has held us together and strengthened us and grown us. Likewise with children, that they're a blessing, and we've grown so much through that. I won't keep going. I apologize. Does anybody have any questions or any? I tried to give you like a high level view, but anything, any specific?
Talked a lot about the opportunities of like becoming a pastor, but then you close the door, or like becoming missionaries and realize that like, that's not what's necessarily true levels and hierarchy and stuff like that. Could you like elaborate more on how you realized that it wasn't supposed to be like that, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. So my best friend Pete, he was in seminary the same time. Well, actually, I guess he actually went to seminary a semester after I did. And so I went to seminary and took Hebrew and teaching, preaching process and homiletics and all those kind of things. And it was, academically, it was interesting and good. But one of the things that I learned in that was if you look at the biblical qualifications for eldership, only one of them does, I'd say the vast majority or 90 whatever percent of seminaries address, and that's able to teach. And one of my friends in seminary, they lived directly above us, and his marriage was probably in worship than mine, because we could hear it all. And nothing against him like personally, right? He's a good guy. But at the time, as we're studying Timothy and Titus, I'd say like he was not biblically qualified to be an elder. And so it took me back, because I was like, wait a second, like we're going to seminary, and this is you learn to become a pastor. And what I saw was it wasn't addressing the heart issues. And so that, I said, okay, we're not going to continue at that school. I want to go to Southern, and so we're thinking we would transfer there, and I did another tour of the Army. And in that process, like that's what I mean by like God closed the door to that. I really thought I was going to go to seminary, and it was going to be this great time, and I was going to study God's Word and learn and become a pastor. And I'm not trying to like bash seminary and say like you shouldn't go if you feel God leading you to that or something. But there's a world of difference between like reading a book and writing a paper and actually doing the work of the ministry. And more specifically, the questions are not okay, so one of them is able to teach. And so learning Greek and Hebrew and those kind of things perhaps are helpful in that. But, are you the husband of one wife, or are you actually literally a one-woman man? So you're not on the make, you're devoted to your spouse. Are you not given too much wine? Do you have a good reputation with outsiders? Are your children walking with the Lord believers? These are character things that have absolutely nothing to do with whether or not you have a degree. And so that was like one, like peeling the layer back. And then my buddy Pete went to seminary, and he had a very similar experience, and he's now a pastor in Savannah, Georgia. And what I saw was just like, and then as I began to study God's Word more, it's like God calls us to be faithful and where we're at. And you look at the vast majority of the Bible, right? Think about like the vast majority of people who lived during the time period the Bible was written. And only a few are actually written about, right? But then when you look at Hebrews and then in Revelation, where it's talking about people who are believers, that said that you joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you had a better and abiding possession. Or the martyrs, and it said that, those for whom the world is not worthy. They didn't love their lives even unto death. And these are not people who are necessarily pastors. These are believers who are just faithful. And those kind of things, I could go into more detail, but I don't know if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay.
In the beginning of your testimony, you talked about like how you diverted from God's word instead of going to it, and when things got more stressful, you kind of diverted more so. And then now, like towards the latter end of your testimony, it sounds like you have this like complete humility when it comes to God's word, and like the attitude's like completely flipped. Like how did that happen?
So one of the things I think that God, when he's doing one thing, I think when God does one thing, he's doing, however many things, right? But one of the things that in allowing me to fall into sin is that it's interesting. So like I read the Bible and I can relate to, like all the characters, all the people, and I can relate to being a Pharisee, and I can relate to Peter, and not in the good ways, right? And so I wouldn't have said it at the time. In retrospect, like I really viewed Christianity as like, here's this list of do's and don'ts, and I can measure myself and I can put check marks, and I feel good about myself when the check marks are more than the minuses, and was very proud. And like if you had known me in high school, you would have thought I was very arrogant and self-righteous, and I was. And the interesting thing was I was not less sinful, right? Like Paul says in Romans 7, like he wouldn't have known what coveting was apart from the law said don't covet, and God showed him his covetous heart. So God allowed me to sin in such a way that you can't just like easily sweep that under the rug and hide that. And though my heart was the same, because it says, when Jesus is questioned, right? He said, "You've heard it said, don't commit murder. I tell you, if you're angry with your brother in heart, you've already done it." Paraphrasing. So God's standard is significantly higher than ours. So I'd already committed, all those sins beforehand. But now, having done them in deed, I stripped away that veil. And God used that to humble me and break me to the point where I realized, like, I have nothing good in me. It's like Paul, I love the book of Romans. Like Paul said, there's nothing good in me that is in the flesh. And it's only by God's grace. And I love in Isaiah where he says, all of our righteous deeds are as filthy rags, or it's much more poignant in Hebrew, having taken a semester of Hebrew. So it's, if you look at it in Hebrew, you go like, ew, and it's like, yeah, that's the point, right? And those are our righteous deeds. Those are our good things. And so if that isn't going to gain us any kind of merit before God, God just showed me that I'm a sinner and I deserve hell. And there's nothing good in me that made God love me, and that it was only because of his grace. And he says, this is the one to whom I'll have regard. He who is humble and trembles at my word. And God has been teaching me to do that. And not perfectly, but if I can exhort you in one thing, is be in God's word daily. You got to be studying God's word. Otherwise, it talks about the armor of God. It's like you take up the shield of faith and the sword of the Spirit and all these things. So if you're not doing that, it says what? So that you can take your stand against the evil one. So if you're not doing that, then you're just expect to fall. And I learned that the hard way. Anything else?
I was originally going to ask on behalf of a couple friends, because I know I have a few close friends who are like planning to enlist. So I was going to ask what advice would you have to those people when it comes to like holding on to their faith, because they're surrounded by like a lot of people who is like immoral, and like dealing with like having your morality like shoved at you,
Yeah.
how do you like hold on to your faith in spite of it?
That's a good question. So I think maybe I can speak at it from both perspectives, having not been faithful to the Lord, but him being gracious and faithful, because he's faithful and we're not, and granting repentance and redeeming me. And then now, again, not perfectly, but trying to walk with the Lord, and even in the midst of officers who are not believers. So one of the things is to understand the environment you're going into. Like you're absolutely right. You're entering it's honestly probably not that different than being here in California or anywhere else, right? Living in a state, going to a state school, as I did, probably similar situation, is that you are surrounded by, you're in the midst of a pagan culture. And, when we're exhorted to not associate with those in sin, he says, now I don't mean the world, because otherwise you'd have to go out of the world. He's talking about believers. But the point is that you live in a sinful world. That's it. And then the other part is realizing that you don't belong. Like, I wrestled with it because I was the geeky kid in high school, and now I was part of ROTC and then in the Army, and it's like a big fraternity, really. And I wanted to fit in, and I wanted to belong, and so, get on that slippery slope. And realizing that God has called us out of that. And he said, be holy as I am holy. And to realize that you're not going to, God has sanctified you to himself. He has set you apart. And so you're not part of that anymore. So though you want to engage with the soldiers you're with, you want to engage in that culture, you're not part of it, and don't try and be part of it. And that was huge, for me when I realized that. And like if you watch the movie or the series or read the books, Band of Brothers, and it talks about there's this mystique that within the Army you have your closest friends and this band of brothers, Mine was absolutely not that experience. One, as an officer, you're kind of separated from the men, and there's reasons behind that, some of them good. And then as a believer, like though I was wrestling with sin internally, like I couldn't just wholeheartedly join in with my fellow lieutenants. And so I was not part of that group. And that was really hard. Yeah. But you realize, like, God, that's not what God has called us to. He's called us to something better, and he's called us to fellowship with him. And it says, anyone, who's left land or fathers or, family for my sake, that you'll receive, 100 times that. So though you sacrifice necessarily being as intimately involved or accepted by the group, God is gracious, and he brings believers along who have fellowship with and opens doors. Does that answer your question? So one of the other things that just thinking of the military is that God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. And when I was after I came back from Iraq, one of my buddies, he and I were in ROTC together. We're not like super close friends, but we're friends. And then we did our officer training, our first 6 months in the Army together at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, or as we like to call it, Fort Lost in the Woods, Misery. And Tim was a solid Christian guy, wife and 3 kids. At the time I was single. He was on his second tour to Iraq. So he went like right after we graduated, and then came back, and then I went, and then he went. And Tim was doing the exact same thing I was doing. He was leading combat patrols, doing route clearances, and an IED, a bomb went off on his Humvee and killed him and his gunner. 2 weeks before he was supposed to go home on R&R for his youngest son's first birthday. And I really wrestled with that. In retrospect, even after Val and I got married, a friend of hers died, and it brought memories of that up, and just remember crying and wrestling with that, and asking God, like, okay, God, at the time I was single and didn't have any kids or anything. I was like, why Tim and not me? Because we were doing the exact same things, and Tim left behind a wife and 3 kids. And that's just such a, it's like, who are you, a man, to question God? And one of my friends from high school, probably a neat, godly guy, older guy in the church, his brother was an Army Ranger, and we were talking. And he reminded me, the Psalm says, precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his saints. And that though we wouldn't choose that, I haven't kept in touch with Tim's widow, but God cares for orphans and widows. And so when things are hard, I share all that to say we look at things very myopically. We only see like a small little sliver of the puzzle, right? Or the picture. You only see what's right in front of you. You don't know how to interpret it. I don't know what you're thinking. I don't know what you're thinking. I don't know your background, your history. God knows all of that. And he knows end from beginning. He knows this event here that he has planned for this good purpose. Like Romans 8 says, he works all things together for good. And so in the midst of that, I'm really kind of angry at God that my friend was killed in action. And thinking, having this guilt, like, why not me? Because, I wouldn't be leaving anybody behind. And my buddy Scotty was like, hey, look, you're looking at this completely wrong. Really, he said. We don't understand what God is doing, and we will not see it this side of heaven necessarily. He never promises that. But he's accomplishing good. We know that for certain. He's sent. And so faith is what? The assurance of things hoped for, evidence of things not seen. So when things are hard, like with my wife, we're we're wrestling with something now, and it's like I say, but God in His Word has said that He works all things together for good. He said that I'll never leave you nor forsake you. He's given us all these host of promises, and we look at God's character and we know who He is, and we can bank on it. And so when you're faced with that hard situation or whatever it is in your life, it doesn't have to be military or a friend getting killed in action, is that you hold on to who God is. Not your situation, but who God is and what He's promised you in His Word. And you say, even though I don't understand it, I don't need to understand it, I can rest in who God is. And a lot of guys have wrestled with experiences in Iraq and wrestling with that, or Afghanistan, and part of it is trying to make sense out of things that you just can't make sense out of. You know, the hidden things belong to God, the revealed things belong to us. And so when we humble ourselves and stop trying to, don't try and figure it all out. That's probably more than answers your question. Okay, I appreciate you guys giving me the opportunity to share, and hopefully what God has done in my life is encouraging to you. And certainly it's not anything in me or what I've done. It's all about God and His faithfulness to us in spite of ourselves. You know, it's not just that we are undeserving of God's grace, it's that we're ill-deserving. You know, we deserve hell, and He gives us, He makes us sons instead.
Thank you. Thank you, Glenn. Last announcements or anything?
Sign Pastor Jason's card.
Yeah.
And I don't know, maybe I should put a poll on YouTube for the date for the Friday movie night. Would that be easier?
Sure.
Yeah.
If that'd be easier.
Okay.
She won at 27, right? Oh, this Friday?
Well, it's good to get the group too.
Oh, okay.
Whoever comes each weekend, send it to me.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Whoever,
Anytime.
or friends that have never been to either.
Yeah, or if you want to bring a friend.
If I could say, actually, it might be better if we plan for the following Friday,
I think that's
the 27th. Let's just go ahead and
there's just a lot of things happen this weekend, so
yeah.
That's fine.
Right.
That's
And then that we have more time to plan. We can get a head count and we can get pizza
okay.
and
the 27th.
I want pizza.
So, pizza.
So
We'll just do
okay,
7 then.
let's plan for the 27th and then sign up for that so we can get a head count. Anything else? Does everybody remember the words to doxology? Oh, perfect, right there.